The tapping stopped. That was the first thing I noticed. For 40 years, the sound of my father's Georgia Tech class ring hitting the table had been the metronome of my anxiety. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm that meant he was waiting, which meant someone was failing him, which meant someone was about to pay. But now the ring was still. Glenn's hand sat heavy on the white linen tablecloth, the gold dull under the chandelier light. He wasn't tapping. He was trembling. Across from him, the bill for a $9,000 dinner sat unopened, anchored by the weight of a trust document he never knew existed. Blythe was crying, and for the first time in her 43 years, her mascara was running because she wasn't performing for an audience. She was crying because the audience had just left the building. I looked at them. I should have felt triumphant. That's what they tell you. Victory feels like a surge, a shout, a fist in the air. I just felt tired. The kind of deep, bone-settling exhaustion that comes after you finally put down a load you've been carrying since you were 6 years old. My emerald dress, the one my mother bought me, the one Blythe had sneered at 3 hours ago, felt light against my skin. I stood up. I didn't look back at the wreckage of the dinner. I didn't look back at the father who had spent a lifetime reminding me I was adopted, or the sister who had just told my son he wasn't real family. I took my son's hand. We walked out into the Savannah night, leaving them with the silence they had earned. 12 days earlier, I didn't know I had a weapon. I didn't even know I was in a fight. The soil samples on my desk were dry. That was the problem with red Georgia clay. It held on to the past too tightly, clutching the water until it drowned the roots, or letting it go so fast, everything withered. You had to amend it. You had to work it. My studio on East Broad Street smelled like peat moss and pencil shavings. It was a small space crammed with seed catalogs and rolled-up blueprints. But it was mine. Darnell and Root Design. I was the Darnell. The Root was a joke I made to myself about being grounded because God knew I didn't have any other family to anchor me. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet enough to hear the trolley bell clanging 2 streets over. I was working on a memorial garden for a client in Ardsley Park. She wanted white hydrangeas. I was trying to tell her gently that hydrangeas needed shade and her yard was a skillet, but people rarely listened to the landscape architect until the leaves turned brown. I reached for the leather-bound journal on the corner of my desk. Laureen's journal. My mother's journal. 3 years she'd been gone, and I still kept it within arm's reach. The leather was worn soft where her hands used to hold it. I flipped it open, looking for her notes on soil pH, but the book fell open to a page from March 5 years ago. Her handwriting was a loop of cursive that looked like vine tendrils. "The camellias are stubborn this year," she had written. "Glenn says, pull them out, plant something practical. I told him camellias bloom in winter when nothing else will. That's not stubbornness, that's courage." I ran my thumb over the ink. I remembered that day. We were in the garden behind the big house on Habersham Street. I had been pruning the azaleas, my hands shaking because Glenn was watching from the porch, tapping that ring against the railing. Mom had touched my wrist. "Steady hands, baby," she'd said. "The garden is yours, all of it. Don't let them pull up what I planted." I thought she meant the flowers. I thought she meant the dirt and the mulch and the difficult camellias. I didn't know she was talking about something else entirely. I didn't know she was warning me. I closed the book. The silence in the studio felt heavy suddenly, the way the air gets right before a thunderstorm breaks over the marsh. I picked up my pencil, trying to focus on the memorial garden, trying to make dead things look like they still had life in them. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first because I had deleted it the day after the funeral. But I knew the pattern. I knew the area code. And before I even slid my thumb across the screen, I felt my stomach drop to the soles of my work boots. I answered. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or the eternal pathetic hope of the child who is still waiting to be picked up from the group home. "Shelby." His voice filled the small room. Low. Certain. It wasn't a greeting. It was an announcement of his presence. Even through the speaker, I could hear the background noise of the house on Habersham Street, the hum of the refrigerator, the silence of a house too big for one man, and underneath it, faint but unmistakable, the tap, tap, tap of metal on granite. "I know who it is," I said. My voice sounded thin to my own ears. "Well, good." He didn't apologize for 3 years of silence. Glenn Darnell didn't apologize. He reframed history until he was the hero of it. "I'm calling because Thanksgiving is in 12 days. I think it's time we had a family dinner. A real one." I gripped the edge of my desk. "A real one." "I'm booking the old Pink House," he said. "The whole private dining room upstairs. Blythe will be there, Tanner the kids, Aunt Carol and Uncle Hank, the whole family." He paused, just long enough for the exclusion to land. "You and the boy, too." The boy. Not Eli, not his grandson, just the boy. An accessory I had acquired like a purse or a pair of shoes he didn't care for. "Glenn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We haven't spoken in 3 years. You told me—" "I know what I said," he cut in. He smoothed over the past like he was spreading concrete. "But your mother would have wanted this. She always wanted us together for the holidays. I'm trying to honor her memory, Shelby. I'm covering everything. Spare no expense. I want it special." My mother. He was using Lorene. He was wrapping his invitation in her ghost. Because he knew it was the one door I couldn't lock. "Why now?" I asked. "Because I'm your father, and I'm asking." He wasn't asking. He was summoning. There was a crack in his voice, though. A tiny fracture in the marble facade. It wasn't warmth. It sounded like desperation. No, that couldn't be right. Glenn Darnell was never desperate. He was the engineer. He built the bridges. He didn't cross them on his knees. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long," he said. "Reservations for 14. The line went dead. No goodbye. Just the click of dismissal. I sat there for a long time staring at the phone. My hand was resting on Lorene's journal again. I felt 20 years younger and 100 years older. He wanted a family dinner. He wanted the picture. He wanted the appearance of the Darnell dynasty intact and thriving. I should have said no. I should have blocked the number again and gone back to my hydrangeas. But the 6-year-old girl inside me, the one who remembered the smell of rosemary on Lorene's hands and the smell of bourbon on Glenn's breath, sat up and paid attention. I left the studio early. I needed to see Eli. My kitchen table was small, a round oak piece I'd bought at an estate sale and refinished myself. It fit 2 people perfectly. 3 was a crowd. 14 was a war. Eli was sitting there when I got home, his homework spread out over a placemat. He was 12, going on 40, lanky and serious, wearing his Savannah Bananas baseball cap backwards. He had my dark hair and his father's eyes, but the watchful stillness in him. That was all mine. "Grandpa Glenn called today," I said. I didn't sugarcoat it. We didn't do that. Eli's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He put it down slowly. He pushed his glasses up his nose, a nervous habit he'd developed in kindergarten. "Okay. He wants us to come to Thanksgiving dinner, the whole family, at the old Pink House." Eli looked at me. He studied my face the way he studied his math problems, looking for the variable that didn't fit. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," I admitted. I sat down across from him. He's family Eli, and Grandma Lorene would have wanted us to try." "Mom." He said it gently. He reached across the table and touched my hand. His fingers were stained with marker. "Are we going because you want to, or because you think you're supposed to?" I looked at him. When had he gotten so smart? Maybe it was the quiet. We had a lot of quiet in this house. "He's my father," I said, but it felt like an excuse even as I said it. Eli picked up his baseball cap and turned it in his hands. "Coach Davis said something at practice yesterday. He said a team isn't the people who wear the same jersey. It's the people who show up when it's raining." He looked me dead in the eye. Grandpa Glenn never shows up when it's raining, Mom. The truth of it hit me in the chest. Glenn didn't just avoid the rain. He complained that I got wet. He blamed me for the storm. You're right, I said. He doesn't. I looked at the window. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the yard. I thought about the emerald dress hanging in the back of my closet. Lorene had bought it for my 43rd birthday, the last one before she died. Green for growth, baby, she'd said. Wear it when you need to feel like a new leaf. I had never worn it. It still had the tags on. We'll go, I said. Eli frowned. Why? Because we're going for us, I said. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt a spark of something that wasn't sadness. It was sharper than that. We're going to show up. We're going to eat the turkey. And if they treat us like we don't belong, we're going to leave with our heads up. But we're not going to hide. Eli nodded slowly. He picked up his fork. Okay, but if Aunt Blythe is mean to you, I'm eating her dessert. I laughed. It felt rusty but real. Deal, I said. I texted Glenn 2 words. We'll be there. I didn't know then that the invitation was a trap. I didn't know that my father was broke or that my sister was drowning or that they viewed my son and me not as guests but as collateral. And I certainly didn't know that in less than 24 hours, a man with a silver beard and a leather briefcase would knock on my studio door and hand me the match that would burn the whole thing down. The bell above the door to my studio didn't just ring, it announced an intrusion. It was Wednesday morning, 11 days before Thanksgiving, and the air inside Darnell and Root Design was thick with the smell of potting soil and the humidity I kept high for the ferns. I looked up from a blueprint to see a man standing in the doorway, who looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to a courtroom in 1990. He was tall and thin, wearing a seersucker suit that had gone out of style 20 years ago and come back in as a statement piece. He carried a leather briefcase that looked older than I was, the leather worn to a rich dark cognac at the handle. He wore wire-rimmed reading glasses on a chain around his neck. I knew him. Dimly. He had been a silhouette in the back row at my mother's funeral, a man who stood apart from the family, left a single white camellia on the casket, and vanished before the reception. Miss Shelby, he said. His voice was dry and crinkled like parchment paper. I don't know if you remember me. Perry Holt, I said, surprised the name came to me so quickly. You were Mom's attorney. He corrected gently. He stepped inside, closing the door against the Savannah traffic. I still am. He sat in the client chair opposite my desk without waiting for an invitation, placing the briefcase on his lap like a shield. He didn't look at the soil samples or the seed catalogs. He looked right at me, his eyes gray and unblinking behind the lenses. Your mother retained me for 22 years, he said. She was the finest client I ever had, and the finest person. I know, I said. My throat felt tight. But the estate was settled 3 years ago. Glenn told you what he believed to be true, Perry cut in. He wasn't rude, just precise. He told you he inherited everything as the surviving spouse. He told you it was standard. Wasn't it? Perry removed his glasses and began to clean them with a handkerchief from his pocket. He took his time polishing the glass in slow, circular motions. The silence stretched until I could hear the fan oscillating in the corner. Glenn Darnell received a conditional right to reside in the marital residence, along with a fixed monthly stipend from a trust. Both are subject to the same behavioral provisions as the rest of the estate, Perry said, putting the glasses back on. Everything else. The investment accounts, the rental properties on Whitaker Street, the savings, approximately $1.2 million. All of that was placed in a discretionary trust. I stared at him. A what? A trust where the trustee has the authority to distribute assets based on conditions set by the grantor. Your mother. He tapped his chest with a long finger. I am the trustee. The room tilted. just a fraction. I put my hands flat on the desk to steady myself. Glenn had been living like a king for 3 years. He had bought a new truck. He had joined the country club. He had acted like a man who owned the world because he had inherited the kingdom. "What conditions?" I asked. Perry clicked the latches of his briefcase. Snap, snap. The sound was loud in the small room. He pulled out a document bound in blue paper and slid it across the desk. He pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. "Read it," he said. "Out loud if you don't mind." I looked at the text. My mother's signature was at the bottom, shaky but determined. "The trustee shall distribute trust assets to beneficiaries who demonstrate through sustained conduct respect for the dignity and equal standing of all members of the Darnell family, regardless of biological relationship." I read. My voice wavered. "Any beneficiary whose conduct as witnessed or documented involves the denigration, exclusion, or financial exploitation of a family member on the basis of adoption status shall forfeit their share, which shall be redirected to the protected beneficiary." I looked up. Perry was watching me. "Your mother named you as the protected beneficiary, Shelby." I couldn't breathe. I looked back at the paper. All this time I thought she had left me nothing. I thought she had chosen peace over me, leaving Glenn in charge to avoid a fight from the grave. But she hadn't left me. She had built a fortress around me. She had spent the last 2 years of her life, the years I was changing her bandages and holding her hand while she slept, constructing a legal bear trap for the husband she knew would try to erase me. "Why now?" I asked. "Why wait 3 years?" "Because she asked me to," Perry said. His voice softened. "She said Perry don't give it to her when she's grieving. She won't use it. Give it to her when she needs it. She'll know when." "And you think I need it now?" "Glenn called you yesterday," he said. I froze. "How do you know that?" "Because he called me last week," Perry said. "He wanted to liquidate the Whitaker Street properties. He wants to sell them to fund a business venture for your sister. I told him they weren't his to sell. He didn't take it well." The pieces clicked together like a lock tumbling open. Glenn's sudden invitation. The emphasis on family. The fancy dinner at the old pink house. He didn't want a reunion. He wanted a show. He needed to prove to the trustee that we were one big happy family so he could unlock the money. "He's broke," I whispered. "Or close to it." "He's spending beyond the stipend," Perry confirmed. "He believes if he puts on a good enough show, I'll release the capital. He doesn't know about the morality clause. Only your mother and I knew." Perry leaned forward. "I have a suggestion. It may sound unusual." "I'm listening." "Let me come to that dinner," he said. "Not as your lawyer, just as an old friend of your mother's. Someone who happened to know Lorene and needed a place to go for the holiday." I sit. I watch. I listen. And then, and if what I suspect about Glenn and Blythe is true, he said, "If they show who they really are when they think no one who matters is watching, I will have everything I need to enforce your mother's wishes." I looked at the emerald dress hanging on the back of my door. I looked at the soil samples on my desk. "The garden is yours, baby." "Okay," I said. "Come to dinner." The next afternoon, I sat in Perry's office on Drayton Street. It smelled of lemon oil and old books, a sanctuary of leather and silence. Perry sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single mahogany tree. "There is one more thing," he said. He slid a small business card across the polished wood. It had his direct line on it. "Georgia is a one-party consent state," he said. He spoke casually as if discussing the weather. "That means that as long as one person in a conversation consents to the recording, it is legal to record it. You are that person." I picked up the card. "You want me to record my own father?" "I want you to protect yourself," he said. "Memory is fallible. Audio is evidence." He stood up and walked to a bookshelf, picking up a framed photograph. He handed it to me. It was Lorene standing in her garden wearing a straw hat and laughing. I had never seen the picture before. She looked younger, lighter, free of the shadow Glenn cast over the house. "She told me once that you were the only thing she ever grew that didn't need her to hold it up," Perry said. "She was wrong about a lot of things, but she wasn't wrong about that. But even the strongest tree needs a fence sometimes." I looked at her face in the photo. She was laughing at something Perry had said. She had a life I didn't know about, a friendship with this quiet, steel-spined man who had kept her secrets for 3 years. "I'm not recording my family, Perry," I said, tucking the card into my pocket. He nodded. He didn't argue. He just looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "The law is a tool, Miss Shelby, like a shovel. You can use it to plant, or you can use it to bury. But you have to have it in your hand." Friday evening, 9 days before Thanksgiving, found me in the backyard on my knees. The sun was going down, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I was under the camellia bush Lorene had planted, my hands deep in the soil. I always thought better when my hands were dirty. It was grounding. But tonight, the earth felt cold. I yanked at a weed, pulling it up by the root. Part of me wanted to call Glenn and cancel. Just retreat. Stay at my small table with Eli and let them have their money and their lies. Why fight for people who didn't want you? But then another part of me, a part I tried to keep pruned back, wanted to see Glenn's face. I wanted to see the moment he realized he wasn't the king. I wanted to see Blythe realize that being born a Darnell didn't make her royalty. Was that justice? Or was it just spite, wearing a nice dress? "You're murdering the time." I looked up. Eli was standing over me, holding a glass of lemonade. He was wearing his pajamas, even though it was only 7 o'clock. I looked down at my hands. I had uprooted a perfectly healthy thyme plant and shredded it. "Sorry," I said, brushing the dirt off my palms. Eli sat down on the grass beside me. He didn't mind the dirt. "You're worried about Thanksgiving. What gives me away?" "You're aggressively gardening in the dark," he said. "And you have that line between your eyebrows." I sighed and sat back on my heels. "Eli, what if it goes badly? What if they're themselves?" "Then we leave," he said simply. "We come home, we eat cereal, and we watch movies. It's just dinner, Mom." "It feels like more than dinner." "It's only more if you let it be," he said. He took a sip of his lemonade. "You told me once that the best gardens grow from the worst soil because the plants have to fight harder." I stared at him. I said that, "Yeah, when my sunflower died in 3rd grade. He put his hand on my muddy glove. "Whatever happens, we'll make something out of it. We always do." He sounded just like her. He had Lorene's wisdom packaged in a 12-year-old boy who liked baseball and video games. I looked at the house. Through the window, I could see the emerald dress hanging on the doorframe where I'd moved it. It looked vibrant against the white paint. It looked alive. "You're right," I said. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. "We're going." I went inside and washed the dirt from my hands. I scrubbed until my skin was pink. Then I picked up my phone. I didn't call. I didn't want to hear the tap of the ring or the condescension in his voice. I typed the message out. "Eli and I will be there. I'll be bringing a +1, an old friend of Mom's." I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. 2 minutes later, the phone buzzed. "Fine, I'll add a seat." He didn't ask who. He didn't care. As far as Glenn was concerned, the seat was already filled with someone who didn't matter, someone who couldn't possibly be a threat to the world he thought he owned. I looked at the calendar on the wall. 12 days. The table was set. The players were in motion. And my mother, silent as the grave she was in, had just dealt the cards. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low over the marsh. Inside the cottage, the air was still. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on my bedroom door, my hands trembling just enough to make the zipper of the emerald dress fight me. I hadn't worn it in 3 years. Lorene had bought it at a boutique on Broughton Street, holding it up against me with that critical, loving tilt of her head. "It brings out the fight in your eyes," she had said. I didn't know I needed to fight back then. I pulled the zipper up. The silk settled against my skin, cool and heavy. It fit perfectly. It didn't look like a party dress anymore. It looked like armor. Eli was waiting in the living room. He had on a button-down shirt that was slightly too big in the shoulders and his Savannah Bananas baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "You look handsome," I said. "Do I have to leave the hat?" he asked, touching the brim. It was his shield, the thing he hid behind when the world got too loud. "Keep it," I said. Grandma Laureen liked baseball too. I picked up my clutch from the entry table. It was small, barely big enough for my keys and lipstick. I slid my phone inside. Then I stopped. The card Perry had given me was burning a hole in my pocket. "Memory is fallible," he had said. "Audio is evidence." I unlocked the phone. My thumb hovered over the voice memo app. It felt wrong, like bringing a knife to a prayer meeting. But then I remembered the tap of Glenn's ring. I remembered the way he rewrote history until I was the villain in every story. I hit record. I slid the phone into the clutch face down, the little red light blinking in the dark leather interior. I didn't know why I finally did it. I told myself it was just insurance. I told myself I would delete it later. "Ready?" Eli asked from the door. "No," I said, grabbing my keys. "Let's go." The old pink house sat on Reynolds Square, a coral-colored mansion that had survived wars, fires, and yellow fever. It was a Savannah institution, the kind of place where the chandeliers were older than the country and the waiters wore white jackets. We walked up the stairs to the private dining room on the second floor. I could hear them before I saw them. Blythe's laugh drifted down the hallway, high and sharp, a sound that always made me think of breaking glass. Underneath it was the low rumble of Glenn's voice directing the staff. I paused in the doorway. My hand tightened on Eli's shoulder. The room was magnificent. A long mahogany table was set for 14, groaning under the weight of crystal glasses and silver candelabras. The smell hit me first. Rich, fatty scents of roasting prime rib truffle oil and expensive red wine. It smelled like money. "There she is," Glenn boomed. He stood at the head of the table holding a tumbler of bourbon. He looked the part of the patriarch, perfectly silver hair swept back, his face flushed with the heat of the room. He opened his arms wide, performing warmth for an audience of aunts and cousins. Come in," he said. He didn't move toward me. He waited for me to come to him. I walked across the Persian rug, feeling every eye in the room land on me. Blythe was already seated to Glenn's right. She stood up, smoothing a dress that I knew cost more than my mortgage payment. She leaned in, kissing the air next to my cheek so she wouldn't smudge her makeup. "Oh my God, look at you," she said, her voice dripping with that specific southern sweetness that masks the poison. "That dress. It is so vintage." She meant old. She meant outdated. She meant I would never wear that. "It was Mom's favorite," I said, keeping my voice even. Blythe's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went flat. "Well, it's certainly a statement." She waved a manicured hand toward the end of the table. "Eli, honey, you're down there with the kids. The grown-ups are sitting up here." I looked where she pointed. The far end of the table was set differently. The crystal goblets were replaced with sturdy glass tumblers. The heavy silver forks were swapped for lighter, simpler ones. It wasn't just a kid's table. It was steerage. "He can sit next to me," I said. "There's an empty chair right here." "Oh, it's just easier this way," Blythe said, dismissing me with a flick of her wrist. "The kids have their own conversation. You know how it is. Let the boys sit with the children," Shelby Glenn said. He took a sip of his bourbon, the ice clinking against the glass. "It's Thanksgiving, not a board meeting. Don't make it complicated." I felt Eli stiffen beside me. He looked at the plastic cup at his assigned seat, then at the crystal glass at mine. He adjusted his glasses, his jaw setting in a hard line. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered. It wasn't okay. It was a demarcation line drawn in linen and silverware. But if I fought it now, if I made a scene before the appetizers were even served, I would be the dramatic one. I would be the problem. That was Glenn's favorite trap. poke you until you snap, and then blame you for snapping. I squeezed Eli's shoulder. I'll come down and check on you, I promised. I took my seat. Aunt Carol was across from me, offering a sympathetic, tight-lipped smile. Uncle Hank gave me a nod. They were good people, but they were silent people. They had spent decades watching Glenn bulldoze over Lorene, and they had learned that survival meant staying out of the way. Glenn tapped his class ring against his water glass. The sound cut through the chatter. Tap, tap, tap. I want to welcome everyone, he said, his voice projecting to the back of the room. It's been a hard few years. Losing Lorene, well, it broke us for a while, but she would have wanted this. She would have wanted us together. He raised his glass. To family, he said, and to provision. I'm covering everything tonight. Spare no expense. This is my gift to you all. To family, the room echoed. I raised my glass, but I didn't drink. My gift. He was paying for this feast with money he believed he had inherited, money that Perry told me was actually held in a discretionary trust. He was buying our loyalty with funds he didn't technically control. I checked my watch. 2:15. Where is this friend of yours? Glenn asked, frowning at the empty chair beside Aunt Carol. We're ready to start service. Parking, I said. He'll be here. As if on cue, a shadow fell across the doorway. Perry Holt stood there. He looked entirely out of place in the opulent room, like a sepia photograph dropped into a Technicolor movie. He held his battered leather briefcase in one hand, his knuckles white against the handle. He wasn't smiling. He was scanning the room, cataloging the wine bottles, the seating arrangements, the hierarchy visible in the silverware. Everyone, I said, standing up. This is Perry Holt. He was a dear friend of Mom's. Glenn squinted, peering over the top of his glasses. He looked at Perry with the vague irritation of a man trying to place a face he feels he should know but doesn't care enough to remember. Lorene's friend Glenn asked. I was her attorney, Perry said. He stepped into the room, his movements precise and quiet. But we were friends, yes. Glenn's face cleared. Ah, the lawyer. I remember. You were at the funeral. I was, Perry said. Well, welcome, Glenn said, waving a hand magnanimously. Any friend of Lorene's. Grab a seat. We were just getting started. Perry walked to the empty chair. He moved differently than the rest of us. We were all family tangled in decades of knots and triggers. He was a witness. He shook Glenn's hand briefly, then Blythe's. Blythe barely looked up from her phone, murmuring a greeting before returning to her screen. Perry sat down. He placed the briefcase on the floor, sliding it carefully under his chair. He didn't tuck it away. He positioned it. It sat there against the table leg, a leather bomb waiting for the fuse. He looked across the table at me. His face was blank, unreadable. Then he looked down the long expanse of white linen to where Eli sat alone at the end, picking at a roll. Perry's eyes narrowed just a fraction. He pulled a napkin from the ring and laid it across his lap. So you knew Lorene, Aunt Carol asked, trying to be polite. How I helped her with some arrangements, Perry said. His voice was soft, forcing the table to quiet down to hear him. Over the years, she was a remarkable woman. She really was, Carol said, her eyes misting. We all miss her. Yes. Well, Glenn said loudly, reclaiming the center of attention. Lorene loved a good party. That's why we're here, to celebrate. He snapped his fingers at a passing waiter. Let's get the wine flowing, he commanded. And bring the appetizers, the big platters. The waiter hurried off. Glenn leaned back in his chair, the king of the castle surveying his domain. He looked at me, and for a second his mask slipped. He gave me a look that was pure calculation, checking to see if I was impressed, if I was grateful, if I was falling back into line. I touched the clutch on the table next to my plate. The phone inside was warm. I smiled back at him. It was the hardest thing I had done in years. Let's eat, I said. The first course arrived, steaming platters of shrimp and grits that smelled like home and cost like gold. The clatter of silverware began. The laughter started up again, brittle and bright. I looked at Perry. He was cutting his shrimp with surgical precision. He wasn't eating. He was watching Glenn. He was watching Blythe. He was waiting. The Lion's Den was open for business, and we had just walked right in. The waiter set the first course down with a flourish that suggested he was presenting crown jewels rather than shellfish. It was shrimp and grits, a Savannah staple, but this was the high church version. The grits were whipped with heavy cream and Gouda, and the shrimp were the size of a child's fist swimming in a tasso ham gravy that smelled like smoke and salt. "Hold on," Blythe said, holding up a hand to stop Glenn from digging in. "The light is perfect right now." She stood up, holding her phone over her plate, tilting it this way and that to catch the gleam of the silverware. She snapped 3 photos, then rearranged her wine glass and snapped 3 more. She was documenting a joy she wasn't feeling to impress people she didn't like on the internet. "Please tag the restaurant," Glenn said, unfolding his napkin. "They treat us well here." Blythe sat back down, satisfied. #Thanksgiving blessings, she murmured as she typed. The conversation started the way it always did, with Glenn holding court. He launched into a story about a redfish he had caught off Tybee Island 2 weeks ago. It was a story we had all heard, but the details inflated with every telling. The fish grew an inch longer. The fight to reel it in lasted 10 minutes longer. I watched him. He ate with enthusiasm, the gravy catching in the corner of his mouth. He didn't ask Aunt Carol about her arthritis. He didn't ask Uncle Hank about his retirement. He broadcasted, and we were expected to be the receivers. So Shelby Aunt Carol said during a rare pause when Glenn was chewing, "How is the business I drove past that install you did on Victory Drive? The azaleas look beautiful." I smiled, grateful for the lifeline. "It's going well. We just hired a 4th crew member, and we're looking at a commercial contract for landscaping." Glenn interrupted. He said the word with a chuckle, wiping his mouth. "She's still playing in the dirt, Carol." I felt my spine stiffen against the chair. "It's landscape architecture, Glenn. I have a degree. I have a license." Glenn waved his fork. "Same thing. You've always been good with your hands." He said it like a consolation prize, like being good with your hands was what you settled for when you didn't have the intellect for real work. Blythe chimed in, tearing a piece of sourdough bread. "I mean, it is so nice that you have a little hobby that pays the bills. Not everyone can say that." "It's not a hobby," I said, keeping my voice level. "It's a company. I pay taxes. I pay salaries." "Oh no, I didn't mean it like that," Blythe said, widening her eyes in mock innocence. "I just meant, compared to a career, like real estate. Or what Daddy did." I looked down at my shrimp. The gravy suddenly looked greasy. I glanced at the end of the table. Eli was eating quietly, his eyes on his plate. He hadn't touched his plastic cup. Uncle Hank leaned forward. "Hey, Eli, how's the baseball season looking?" Eli looked up, surprised to be addressed by an adult. "It's good. My batting average is up to 300. Hank nodded appreciatively. "That's solid. Smart kid. Takes after his mom." Glenn didn't respond to that. He didn't even look at Eli. He just tapped his ring against the table. Tap, tap, a signal. The subject was boring him. "Pass the wine," Glenn said. The waiters cleared the appetizers and brought out the main event. It was obscene. A 20-pound turkey, golden and glistening, a prime rib roast with a peppercorn crust, lobster tails drenched in butter, truffle mashed potatoes, green bean casserole with fried onions. It was enough food to feed the entire block on East Broad Street for a week. Glenn surveyed the spread like a general inspecting his troops. He looked at the lobster tails, then at me. "I wanted to make sure we had plenty," he said. "I know things have been tight for you. I didn't take the bait. I just took a scoop of potatoes." "So," Blythe said, her voice raising an octave, "I have some news." She waited. We all stopped eating. This was the cue. "I'm launching my own brokerage," she announced, beaming. Glenn slammed his hand on the table in delight. "That is my girl, an entrepreneur. The Darnell business gene right there. I'm opening a luxury division." Blythe continued, talking fast. We're going to focus on the historic district and the islands. I've already got a lead on an office space on Bull Street. We're going to do a full remodel, high-end, modern. I looked at Tanner, her husband. He was staring into his wine glass looking tired. He sold commercial insurance, and I knew for a fact his commissions had been down for 2 quarters. He looked like a man watching a car crash he was sitting inside of. That sounds expensive, I said. A startup, a remodel, a lease on Bull Street. How much capital are we talking about? Blythe let out a little laugh, brittle as spun sugar. Oh, Shelby. You don't need to worry about the numbers. That's between me and Daddy. Glenn nodded, slicing into his prime rib. Family business stays in the family. The words hung in the air, suspended over the centerpiece. Family business stays in the family. The implication was clear. I was not family. The money was not my concern. But I knew where the money was coming from. Glenn's stipend was $3,200 a month. That covered his utilities and his country club dues with maybe enough left over for groceries. It did not cover a commercial lease. It did not cover a luxury brokerage. He was either borrowing against assets he didn't own, or he was planning to sell something big. I glanced at Perry. He was eating his turkey methodically, his face a mask of polite disinterest, but his left hand was resting on his lap, inches from the briefcase under his chair. He had caught it. Family business. The exclusion, the financial maneuvering. I took a sip of water. It tasted metallic. By the time the main course was half eaten, the wine bottles were multiplying. Glenn was on his 3rd bourbon, his face flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Blythe had switched to Chardonnay and was getting louder. The room felt smaller, the air used up. Blythe turned her attention to Kinsley, her 9-year-old daughter, who was poking at her lobster. Make sure you eat the protein, sweetie, Blythe said. You need your energy for tennis camp. She looked across the table at me, her eyes bright and unfocused. So, Eli, what school are you at now? It's a magnet school, I said before Eli could answer. He tested into the advanced program. Blythe nodded slowly, lips pursed. Right. Public school. It's a competitive admission, I said. I'm sure it's fine, Blythe said. We just feel like private school gives kids more structure. You know, for their future. The network is so important. Nothing wrong with public school, Glenn said, waving a hand dismissively. That is where most people end up. He said most people the way you would say rodents. Kinsley looked up from her plate. She had whipped cream on her upper lip. She looked at Eli, then at her mother, then back at Eli. Are you really Aunt Shelby's son? She asked. The table went quiet, the kind of quiet that has texture heavy and suffocating. My mom says you might not be a real Darnell, Kinsley said. Because you don't look like us. Blythe gasped, but it was theatrical. Kinsley, shush. I looked at Eli. He had stopped chewing. He put his fork down slowly. He looked at Kinsley, then at Glenn, then at me. My mom is a Darnell, Eli said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor underneath. So I am a Darnell. Blythe sighed, swirling her wine. Well, honey, it is complicated. Your mom was adopted. So technically, Blythe, I said. My voice was low. Warning. I am just saying, sweetie, Blythe continued, turning to Eli with a pitying smile. Family trees are tricky when there is no blood connection. I'm not saying we don't love you. I'm just explaining the biology. Stop, I said. Glenn slammed his glass down. Nobody is saying anything bad, Shelby. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic. His favorite word. Whenever I bled, I was being dramatic. Whenever I asked them to put down the knife, I was being sensitive. I looked at Perry. He had stopped eating. He had taken a pen from his pocket and was making a small note on his napkin. I looked at my son, 12 years old, sitting at the end of a table loaded with food that cost more than my car, being told he was a genetic error. I stood up. Blythe rolled her eyes. Here we go. I didn't scream. I didn't flip the table. I picked up my plate. I picked up my silverware and my crystal glass. I walked down the length of the table past the lobster tails and the truffle potatoes, past Glenn's red face and Blythe's smirk. I walked to the end of the table where the plastic cups were. I pulled out the empty chair next to Eli. I sat down. I put my arm around his shoulders. I could feel the tension vibrating off him like heat. "He is a real Darnell," I said, looking directly at Blythe. "He is the best one at this table." Blythe scoffed. Glenn snorted into his bourbon, but Aunt Carol nodded. And Uncle Hank put down his fork and looked at Glenn with something like disgust. We finished the meal in silence at the end of the table. The divide was physical now, the grown-ups and the outcasts. But the dessert was coming. And if I thought the main course was heavy, I had no idea how hard the breadbasket was about to hit. The coffee arrived in delicate china cups, accompanied by the smell of burnt sugar and bourbon. The feast was winding down, leaving behind a battlefield of crumpled napkins and half-eaten sides. My stomach was in knots, twisted tight enough to keep me from touching the pumpkin cheesecake Blythe was photographing from a fourth angle. Glenn stood up from the head of the table. He was swaying slightly, his face a map of broken capillaries, but he moved with a purpose. He walked down the length of the table past the cooling turkey and the empty wine bottles until he reached the end where I sat. He pulled out the empty chair beside me. He sat down heavily, the wood creaking under his weight. He put his hand on mine. His palm was warm and dry. It was a father's hand. For a split second, my breath hitched. I looked at his hand covering mine, something ancient and hopeful shifted in my chest. "I know I haven't been around," he said. His voice was lower now, stripped of the performance he put on for the rest of the room. "I know these last few years have been hard on you." He squeezed my hand. "Your mother would have wanted us to try," he said. My heart cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was enough to let the light in. This was it. This was what I had put on the dress for. This was why I had walked into the lion's den. "She bought it for me," I said, touching the silk of my dress. "She had good taste," he said. He almost smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was human. "Listen, Shelby. I want to talk to you about something. After dinner. The house, some financial things. Family matters." My chest tightened, but hope is a stubborn weed. "Okay," I said. "Good," he said. He patted my hand twice. "Good girl." The air left the room. "Good girl." He said it the way you would speak to a golden retriever that had finally stopped barking. He didn't see a daughter. He saw compliance. He saw a problem that had managed to behave itself for 2 hours. He stood up and walked back to his throne at the head of the table, leaving me cold. I sat there staring at my hand. I felt foolish. I felt small. But mostly I felt the fool for believing even for a second that the leopard had changed its spots just because it was hungry. The waiters began to clear the plates. The spell of the meal was broken and the reality of the leftovers set in. Blythe was already directing the staff like a traffic cop at a 4-way stop. "Box the lobster tails for us," she commanded, pointing a manicured finger. "And the prime rib. Make sure you get all the au jus. Oh, and the cheesecake. Kinsley loves it." She was claiming it all. The $10,000 spread was disappearing into to-go boxes that would go home to her refrigerator. She treated the feast not as a shared meal, but as a harvest she was entitled to reap. "Can you put the truffle potatoes in a separate container?" she asked the waiter. "They get soggy if they touch the green beans." Eli had been sitting quietly beside me, reading a paperback he had hidden on his lap. He closed the book. He looked at the silver platter in the center of the table where 3 lobster tails still sat glistening in butter. He reached for one. Blythe's hand shot out like a cobra. She grabbed his wrist. She didn't tap him. She didn't wave him away. She physically grabbed the bone of his wrist and stopped his hand in midair. "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with that poisonous honey. "Those are for the family." The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in stages like lights turning off in a warehouse. Aunt Carol stopped mid-sentence. Uncle Hank froze with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Even Tanner looked up from his phone. "Blythe," I said. My voice was very quiet. Let go of his hand. She laughed, a nervous tinkling sound, but she didn't let go immediately. "I am not being mean. Shelby, I just meant, these are expensive, and we were planning to take them home for tomorrow." She looked at Glenn for support. She looked at the man who had paid for the dinner, the patriarch who made the rules. Glenn looked at Eli. He looked at the lobster tail. Then he looked at the bread basket sitting near his elbow. It held 2 stale rolls, hard as stones left over from the beginning of the meal. "The boy can have bread," Glenn said. He pushed the basket. It slid across the white linen tablecloth with a soft hiss. It spun slowly as it traveled down the length of the table, past the crystal, past the silver, past the wine, until it came to a stop in front of my 12-year-old son. "You should have packed him something from home," Shelby Glenn said, pouring himself another drink. "Something more his speed." Aunt Carol made a noise in her throat, a strangled sort of gasp. "Glenn, for God's sake." What Glenn asked, looking genuinely confused by the objection. "I am being practical. This dinner cost a fortune. Not everyone at this table has the same standing." Blythe released Eli's wrist. She smoothed her napkin, emboldened by her father's ruling. "Look, I know it is uncomfortable, but Shelby isn't. I mean, she was adopted. We love her, but Eli isn't exactly a Darnell by blood, and this dinner is for family." Eli looked at the bread basket. He looked at the 2 rolls sitting there like a verdict. He didn't cry. He didn't throw it. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up his nose, with a dignity that made him look 10 feet tall. He looked at me. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set in a line I recognized. It was my jaw. I looked at Glenn. I looked at Blythe. I looked at the feast they were hoarding and the crumbs they had offered my son. Every muscle in my body coiled tight. I could feel the blood thumping in my ears, a war drum beating against my skull. "Noted," I said. I didn't shout it. I didn't spit it. I spoke the word the way you would mark a coordinate on a map for an airstrike. Glenn blinked his glass, pausing halfway to his mouth. Blythe tilted her head, her earrings catching the light. "What is that supposed to mean?" Blythe asked. "It means I heard you," I said. I looked across the table at Perry. He was wiping his mouth with his napkin. His face was stone expressionless and cold, but his hand had moved. It was under the table now, resting on the handle of the leather briefcase. He nodded. Once. A movement so small you would miss it if you weren't looking for it. I nodded back. "Don't eat the bread," I whispered to Eli. "I wasn't going to," he whispered back. The moment passed for them. Blythe went back to directing the boxing of the leftovers. Glenn went back to his bourbon. They thought it was just another scene, another reminder of the pecking order they had established decades ago. They thought the water would smooth over the stone like it always did. They didn't know the stone had just cracked. The atmosphere at the table had fractured. Aunt Carol and Uncle Hank were staring at their plates, the silence around them thick with shame. They were the witnesses who saw the crime but were too afraid to call the police. Carol leaned across the table toward me. Her voice was a hushed whisper. "I am sorry, Shelby. That was terrible." "It is not your fault, Carol," I said. "It is," though she said, and her eyes were full of a helpless sort of grief. "We all let it happen. We always let it happen." She was right. This wasn't new. This was the same dynamic that had played out when I was 10, and Blythe got the pony and I got the riding lessons so I could watch her. It was the same dynamic when I graduated college and got a handshake while Blythe got a European tour. The only difference was that tonight I had a witness who wasn't afraid. Eli slid his chair back. He didn't slam it. He just stood up. "I am going to the bathroom," he said quietly. I watched him walk away. His shoulders were hunched, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He walked past the table where his cousins were fighting over an iPad, past the grandfather clock in the hallway, and disappeared into the shadows. I started to get up, but Perry caught my eye. He stood up casually, picking up his water glass. "I will stretch my legs," he announced to no one in particular. He walked past Eli's empty chair. He paused for a second, looking at the bread basket that still sat there, an accusation in wicker. He followed my son into the hallway. I waited. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. From the hallway, I heard a murmur of voices. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew the tone. Perry's voice was low and rumbling. Then for a brief second, Perry reappeared in the doorway. He looked at me. He looked at the bread basket. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you tonight," I heard him say to the empty air in the hallway, loud enough for me to hear. I saw Eli's shadow straighten on the wall. "You knew her." Eli's voice drifted back, small but curious. "Better than most," Perry said. He walked back toward the table, his face composed. But as he sat down, he moved the briefcase. He pulled it out from under the table and set it beside his chair, clear of the tablecloth, ready to be opened. Glenn tapped his ring on the table again. "Tap, tap, tap. I have an announcement," he said, standing up. He looked at the room with a flush of victory, the king about to bestow a decree. He didn't see the briefcase. He didn't see the look in my eyes. He didn't know that he had just handed the executioner the axe. Glenn stood at the head of the table, his silhouette looming against the flocked wallpaper of the private dining room. He raised his wine glass, but he didn't drink. He tapped his Georgia Tech class ring against the crystal rim. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, a command for silence that cut through the low murmur of the room. The waiters froze near the sideboard. Aunt Carol lowered her fork. "I have an announcement," Glenn said. His voice was thick with bourbon and self-importance, the voice of a man who believed he was the architect of the world around him. "I have been doing some thinking. About the future. About legacy." He paused, letting the word hang there. "Legacy. I have decided to sell the house on Habersham Street," he said. The air left the room. Aunt Carol gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Sell it, Glenn. That house has been in Lorraine's family for 3 generations. You can't just sell it." "It is a big house," Carol Glenn said, dismissing her shock with a wave of his hand. "Too big for one man, and the upkeep is a nightmare. I have been talking to Blythe about her new venture. She needs capital to get this brokerage off the ground. I need to simplify. It makes sense." He wasn't looking at Carol. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Blythe, who was beaming like she had just won a pageant. The house on Habersham Street. The house where Lorraine had planted the first camellia bush in the backyard. The house where she had brought me home when I was 6 years old, holding my hand as we walked up the front steps, promising me that I would never have to pack my bags again. To Glenn, it was an asset. To Blythe, it was a bank account. To me, it was the only place on earth where I had ever been a daughter. "And now it is mine," Glenn continued, his voice hardening. "Surviving spouse. That is how it works. Lorraine left everything to me to manage. I can do what I want with it." "It is just a house," Shelby Blythe said, catching the look on my face. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes glittering. "It is not like you have any claim to it. I mean, let's be realistic." I looked at Perry. He hadn't moved. His face was a mask of polite disinterest, but his fingers were gripping the linen napkin in his lap so hard the knuckles were white. Glenn thought he owned the house. Perry knew the truth. But Perry didn't speak. Not yet. Glenn raised his glass higher. "To new beginnings," he said. "To keeping the family moving forward." Blythe raised her glass. Tanner raised his, looking miserable. I did not move. Emboldened by the toast, Blythe leaned forward, her elbows on the table. "Once we sell the house and I get the brokerage going, this family is going to be so much stronger," she said. "We can finally invest in things that matter. In the future." She looked pointedly at her children Kinsley and Bowen, who were oblivious to the fact that their inheritance was being carved out of my mother's ghost. "You keep saying this family," I said. My voice was steady, but it felt like it was coming from a great distance. "Am I part of this family?" Blythe sighed, the long, dramatic exhale of someone forced to explain quantum physics to a toddler. "Oh, Shelby," she said. "Of course you are. But let's be honest. Mom adopted you because she wanted to. Daddy didn't. And now that Mom is gone." She shrugged. It was a small movement, a lifting of one silk-clad shoulder, but it carried the weight of an eviction notice. "Nobody is saying you aren't welcome," Glenn said, jumping in to smooth over the rough edge Blythe had exposed. "But when it comes to inheritance to the house, to the heavy decisions, you have to understand your position." "My position," I repeated. "You are adopted," Shelby Glenn said. He said it gently, as if breaking the news of a terminal illness. "We love you, but the bloodline matters. Blythe is a Darnell. You are... well, you are a Darnell by paperwork." The room was silent. Even the waiters had stopped moving. And honestly, Blythe added, picking up the baton, if we are being practical, Eli isn't a Darnell at all. He is not adopted by us. He is not blood. He is Shelby's son, and Shelby isn't really... The chair scraped against the hardwood floor. A harsh screeching sound that stopped Blythe mid-sentence. Eli stood up. He was shaking. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, pressing into the fabric of his chinos. He looked at Glenn. He looked at Blythe. "I can hear you," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. He was 12 years old, trying to sound like a man and failing in the most heartbreaking way possible. "I can hear everything you are saying about me." Blythe blinked. "Oh, sweetie, I didn't mean..." "You invited us here," Eli said, tears spilling over the rim of his glasses. "My mom put on a dress for this. She drove here hoping you would be different. And you..." He couldn't finish. He turned away, grabbing his baseball cap from the table. He didn't run, but he walked fast, heading for the double doors with his head down, trying to outpace his own humiliation. My son. I watched him go. I felt something snap inside my chest. It wasn't a bone. It was the tether. The long, frayed rope that had bound me to Glenn Darnell's approval for 40 years finally severed. This was the worst thing that could happen. Not my own pain. I was used to that. I had calluses on my heart from decades of handling their thorns. But Eli, they had hurt Eli. I looked at the table, the lobster shells, the empty wine bottles, the debris of a $10,000 meal that my mother's money had paid for. I stood up. "Who is paying for this dinner?" Glenn, I asked. Glenn blinked, caught off guard by the pivot. "I told you. I am covering it." "No," I said. "Who is actually paying? Because you told everyone you inherited Mom's estate. But your retirement from the DOT doesn't cover a 5-figure tab at the old pink house." Glenn's face turned a mottled purple. He slammed his ring against the table. "Tap! That is none of your business," he snarled. "You invited me here to pay for it, didn't you?" I asked. My voice rose, filling the room. "You need my card because yours is maxed out. Just like you needed me to pay for Mom's funeral. Just like the house repairs last spring that you called a family expense." "You need to lower your voice," Glenn said, his eyes darting to the waiters. "Or what I asked. You will remind me I am adopted again." Glenn's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Blythe opened her mouth to defend him, then closed it, looking suddenly unsure. I turned my back on them. I walked toward the doors where Eli had vanished. As I passed Perry's chair, a hand shot out and caught my wrist. It was gentle but firm. "Not yet," Perry whispered. I looked down at him. My eyes were burning. "My son is standing in a hallway, alone," I hissed. "I know," Perry said. His eyes were steady behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Go to him, but come back. Don't leave yet." "Why?" "Because your mother didn't build this for you to walk away without finishing it." I looked at the briefcase beside his chair. I looked at Glenn, who was pouring himself another drink with a shaking hand. I pulled my arm free. I found Eli in the upstairs hallway, sitting on the floor against the damask wallpaper. The light from the sconces was dim here. He had his knees pulled up to his chest, his glasses off, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. I slid down the wall beside him. The silk of my dress pooled on the carpet. "Hey," I said. "I don't want to go back in there," he said. His voice was thick. "You don't have to," I said. "We can leave right now." He sniffed, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Why are they like that?" "Mom, what did we do?" "Nothing," I said. "We did nothing wrong. Then why? How do you explain narcissism to a child? How do you explain that some people are so small inside that they have to make everyone else smaller just to feel like they exist? Some people are broken." "Baby," I said, resting my head against his shoulder, "and instead of fixing themselves, they break the things around them to make the pieces match." Eli put his glasses back on. He looked at me, his eyes magnified and serious. "Grandma Lorene wasn't like that," he said. "No," I said. "She wasn't. I wish she was here." I pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. He smelled like soap and the peppermint from the after-dinner mints he had pocketed earlier. "She is," I said. "You just can't see her yet." Footsteps clicked on the hardwood floor. Slow, measured. I looked up to see Perry standing at the end of the hallway. He looked like a statue brought to life calm amidst the wreckage. "How is he?" Perry asked. 12 years old and sitting on a hallway floor because adults told him he doesn't belong," I said. Perry nodded. "Your mother was afraid of exactly this." "Then why didn't she do something while she was alive?" I asked, the bitterness rising in my throat. "She did," Perry said. "That is what is in the briefcase." He kneeled down. He didn't care about the crease in his trousers. He looked me in the eye. "Shelby, I have everything I need. Tonight is not an isolated incident." Glenn's statement after the funeral 3 years ago. 3 years of complete exclusion, and now tonight's conduct regarding the house and the bloodline, all on record and witnessed by myself, your Aunt Carol, and your Uncle Hank. Together they constitute a clear and sustained violation of the morality clause. I can file a distribution action as soon as the courthouse opens on Monday. "What about the house?" I asked. Perry allowed himself a very small, very grim smile. "Glenn can't sell what he doesn't own," he said. "Your mother transferred the Habersham Street property to the trust 18 months before she died. Glenn has been living there at the trust's discretion." I stared at him. "He doesn't even own the house." "He never did," Perry said. He stood up, brushing off his knees. "The weapon is loaded, Miss Shelby. You just have to decide if you want to pull the trigger." The ladies' room at the old pink house was a cavern of white marble and gold fixtures, quiet enough to hear the drip of a faucet somewhere in the last stall. I locked the heavy door behind me and leaned against it. The wood felt cool against my back, a solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned liquid. I walked to the sink. An antique mirror hung over the basin, the glass slightly desilvered at the edges, making my reflection look ghostly. I looked at the woman staring back at me. 46 years old. I was wearing a silk dress my dead mother had bought me, standing in a restaurant she had loved, fighting a war she had started without telling me. I looked at the emerald silk. It was wrinkled at the waist where Eli had pressed his face against me in the hallway. "I am tired, Mom," I said to the empty room. My voice bounced off the tile hollow and flat. I could leave. The thought was seductive. I could walk out the side door with Eli, drive home to my small cottage, and let Perry handle the legal violence. He had the documents. He had the witnesses. I didn't need to be there to watch the axe fall. That would be the dignified thing to do. The peaceful thing. But there was something rotting in my chest that wouldn't be satisfied by a court order arriving in the mail 3 weeks from now. There was a hunger that had been starving for 40 years. I didn't just want justice. I wanted Glenn to hear it. I wanted Blythe to see it. Was that revenge? Or was it just the final stage of grief? I opened my clutch. My hands were shaking just enough to make the clasp click loudly. I checked the phone, still recording. The little red timer was counting seconds of silence. I saw Perry's card. And then, tucked behind it, I saw the folded piece of paper I had shoved in there this morning. It was a page from Lorene's gardening journal. I had used it as a bookmark for weeks, never reading it closely, just liking the feel of her handwriting near me. I pulled it out. The paper was cream-colored soft with age. I unfolded it on the marble counter. It wasn't a list of soil amendments. It wasn't a sketch for a new bed of hydrangeas. It was a letter. The date at the top was 4 months before she died. The handwriting was hers, the loops a little looser than they used to be, the ink trailing off where her hand must have gotten tired. For Shelby, it read, "When the garden needs her." My breath hitched. I braced my hands on the cold marble and began to read. My darling girl. If you are reading this, then it is time. Perry will have told you about the trust. I am sorry I didn't tell you myself. I was afraid you would insist I leave everything to Glenn because that is who you are. You give. You always give until there is nothing left of you to keep. But here is what I need you to understand. Giving doesn't mean letting people take. I chose you. Not because I needed a project or because I wanted to be charitable. I chose you because I walked into that group home and I saw a little girl sitting by a window talking to a plant. She was telling it that it was doing a good job growing even though no one was watering it. That girl was you, and you were describing yourself without knowing it. Glenn never understood why I adopted you. He thought it was a phase, a hobby. He was wrong about many things, but he was most wrong about that. You were never my charity, Shelby. You were my answer. Everything in the trust is yours. Not because Glenn doesn't deserve it, although God knows he has tested me. He has his share. But because I know what he will do to you and Eli if I am not there to stop him. I have watched him do it for 40 years, and I chose peace over truth every time. I was wrong. I am sorry. Don't choose peace over truth, Shelby. You are braver than I was. The garden is yours. All of it. Not just the camellias. Love that doesn't end, Mom. The tears came then, but they weren't the hot, stinging tears of humiliation I had shed 1,000 times before. These were cold. They were clarifying. They washed over me like rain on a drought-stricken field. You were my answer. For 40 years, I had stood in the lobbies of my life waiting for someone to pick me up. I had waited for Glenn to see me. I had waited for Blythe to accept me. I had waited for the world to tell me I was real. But I had been chosen the whole time. She had chosen me when she signed the adoption papers. And she had chosen me again from her deathbed when she rewrote her will to build a wall around my life that Glenn Darnell couldn't climb. I looked at the phrase again. The garden is yours. All of it. I had thought she meant the plants. I thought she meant the dirt and the mulch and the work. She meant the estate. She meant the house. She meant the power. I wiped my face. I turned on the cold water and let it run over my wrists. I splashed it on my cheeks, washing away the salt and the heat. Something inside me shifted. It felt like a bone resetting after a long dislocation. A click. A lock engaging. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back didn't look like a landscape architect who played in the dirt. She didn't look like a little sister who sat at the kids' table. She looked like the owner of the building. I folded the letter carefully. I put it back in the clutch right next to the phone that was recording every second of my resurrection. Don't choose peace over truth. I snapped the clutch shut. I walked out of the bathroom. Eli was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall where I had left him. He looked up when the door opened. He saw my face and he straightened up. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Mom?" he asked. I held out my hand. "We are going back in," I said. He hesitated. "Why?" "Because your grandmother left us something," I said. "And it is time to open it." He took my hand. His grip was small but solid. We walked down the hallway together, the carpet swallowing the sound of our footsteps. We reached the double doors of the private dining room. I didn't pause. I didn't knock. I pushed them open. The air in the room was stale heavy with the smell of meat and wine and secrets. Glenn was still talking. Of course he was. He was leaning forward, gesturing with his wine glass, explaining something to a pale-faced tanner. "So the market is correcting," Glenn was saying. "That is why we have to move fast on the sale." He stopped when he saw me. I walked to the table. I didn't slink to my seat. I walked with my chin up the emerald dress, catching the light from the chandelier. I felt tall. I felt dangerous. Blythe looked up from her phone. "Oh, good," she said, her voice tight. "You are back. We were just discussing the timeline for listing the property." I pulled out my chair. I sat down. I gestured for Eli to sit beside me. I placed my clutch on the table, right in front of me. The room went quiet. They sensed it. Animals always sense when the barometer drops before the storm hits. Aunt Carol looked at me, her eyes widening slightly. She saw it. Perry saw it. He moved his briefcase from the side of his chair to the space directly in front of him. He unlatched the brass buckles. Click. Click. Glenn didn't see it. That was his fatal flaw. He never saw me. He only saw the version of me he had created in his head, the grateful, silent charity case. "Glenn," I said. He blinked. I hadn't interrupted him in 40 years. "Before you go on," I said, "I would like to say something." He sighed an exaggerated puff of air. "Well, make it quick, Shelby. We are trying to conduct family business here. I will take exactly as long as I need," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Kinsley looked up from her iPad. I looked at Perry. I nodded. Perry reached into his briefcase. Glenn looked at the lawyer, then at me. His ring tapped the table once. Tap. But it sounded hollow this time. Uncertain. "What is going on?" Glenn asked. I stood up. I placed my hands on the white linen tablecloth. "You asked me what noted meant," I said. I looked him dead in the eye. "Let me show you." A waiter appeared at my elbow, a shadow in a white jacket holding a black leather folder. He placed it gently in the center of the table, right between the centerpiece of autumn gourds and the empty wine bottles. The bill. The timing was impeccable, a piece of unintentional theater that Glenn could not have staged better himself. He looked at the folder. He didn't reach for it. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, expanding his ribcage like a man who had just conquered a continent. "I seem to have left my wallet in the truck," Glenn said. He patted his pockets theatrically. "The valet has the keys." Blythe made a show of reaching for her purse. "Oh, Daddy let me get it." She paused, her hand hovering over her designer bag. "Actually," she said, offering a tight apologetic grimace to the table, "my card is maxed out from the brokerage setup fees. Until the funding comes through next week, I am a little tapped." She looked at me. Glenn looked at me. The table waited. This was the choreography we had danced since I got my first paycheck at 22. Glenn announced the celebration. Blythe ordered the wine, and Shelby paid the bill. It was the price of admission. It was the tax I paid to sit at a table where I wasn't wanted. I picked up the leather folder. The leather was soft warm from the waiter's hand. I opened it. $9,847. $9,000 for a dinner where my son was offered stale bread. $9,000 for a dinner where I was told I was a daughter by paperwork. I looked at the number. I looked at Glenn, who was watching me with an expectant, arrogant tilt to his chin. He wasn't worried. The system had always worked. I closed the folder. I set it back down on the table. I didn't reach for my purse. "I am not paying for this dinner, Glenn," I said. The room went still. Glenn's ring, which he had started tapping against his glass again, stopped in midair. "Excuse me," he said. "You heard me," I said. "Shelby, don't be ridiculous," he hissed, leaning forward. "Someone has to pay the man." "Someone does," I agreed. "But it is not me. Not tonight. Not ever again." Glenn's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson. He looked at the waiter who was staring fixedly at a point on the wall, trying to disappear. "Perry," I said, turning to the man beside me. "I think it is time." Perry nodded. He lifted the battered leather briefcase onto the table. He thumbed the brass latches. Click, click. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the silence of the room. Glenn watched the lid rise, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell is going on?" Glenn demanded. "This," I said, pointing to the briefcase, "is what noted means." I stood up. My legs felt solid, rooted to the floorboards. I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every person there. Aunt Carol looked terrified. Uncle Hank looked intrigued. Blythe looked annoyed, her thumb hovering over her phone screen. "I need everyone at this table to listen," I said. My voice was calm. It didn't tremble. Not because I am being dramatic, not because I am being sensitive, but because what I am about to say involves every person in this room. Glenn opened his mouth to bark an order, but Perry raised one hand. It was a small gesture, palm out, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Glenn snapped his mouth shut. "My mother adopted me when I was 6 years old," I said. Glenn has reminded me of this at every opportunity for 40 years. Tonight, he reminded my 12-year-old son. I looked down at Eli. He was looking up at me, his eyes wide behind his glasses. I gave him a small nod. "I've got this." "My mother also died 3 years ago," I continued. "I was with her for every day of those last 2 years. Every medication, every hospital visit, every night in the ICU when the machines beeped and nobody else was there." I turned my gaze to Blythe. Nobody else was there. Blythe's face went white. She opened her mouth to protest, to offer an excuse about her children or her schedule, but the truth was a heavy thing, and it pinned her to her chair. "After Mom died, Glenn told me, and I quote, 'Now that Lorene is gone, there is no reason to keep pretending. You were her project, not my daughter.'" Aunt Carol let out a sharp gasp. Uncle Hank set his wineglass down hard. I accepted that, I said. I left. I stayed away for 3 years. And then Glenn called me. He invited me to this dinner, and I thought maybe something had changed. I reached out and picked up the bread basket. It was light empty except for the 2 stale rolls. I set it down directly in front of Glenn. Nothing changed. Perry stood up. He smoothed his seersucker suit. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a document bound in blue paper. "My name is Perry Holt," he said. His voice was a baritone rumble designed for courtrooms. "I am an estate and trust attorney with Holt and Rowe. I was Lorene Darnell's personal attorney for 22 years, and I am the trustee of her estate." Glenn scoffed a wet, dismissive sound. "What are you talking about? I am the executor. You are the beneficiary of a marital trust," Perry corrected him, sliding his reading glasses onto his nose. "You receive a conditional residence right and a monthly stipend, both subject to the trust's behavioral provisions. The remaining assets, approximately $1.2 million, are held in a discretionary trust." Glenn froze. A discretionary trust? Perry opened the document. He ran his finger down the page. Section 7. Paragraph 3. Perry read, "The trustee shall distribute trust assets to beneficiaries who demonstrate through sustained conduct respect for the dignity and equal standing of all members of the Darnell family, regardless of biological relationship." He looked up over his glasses, fixing Glenn with a stare that could strip paint. "Any beneficiary whose conduct, as witnessed or documented, involves the denigration, exclusion, or financial exploitation of a family member on the basis of adoption status shall forfeit their share, which shall be redirected to the protected beneficiary." He set the document down on the table. "The protected beneficiary is Shelby Ann Darnell." Glenn's hand was shaking so badly that his wine sloshed over the rim of his glass, staining the white tablecloth red. "This isn't real," Glenn stammered. "Lorene wouldn't... She wouldn't do that to me." "Lorene spent the last 18 months of her life restructuring this estate with me," Perry said. She transferred the Habersham Street property to a family trust entity 18 months before she died. Glenn never checked the deed records. He assumed ownership transferred automatically to him as surviving spouse. It did not. "I own that house," Glenn shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "You do not," Perry said simply. "Daddy!" Blythe shrieked, her voice cracking. "What is he talking about? What about my brokerage? You said the money was there." Glenn looked at her, his eyes wild. He looked like a cornered animal. "He is lying," Glenn spat. "This is a trick. Shelby put him up to this." I walked around the table until I was standing next to Glenn. I looked down at him. The man who had loomed over my entire life suddenly looked very small. "Mom chose me," I said quietly. "She chose me twice. Once when she adopted me, and once when she protected me from all of you." I paused, thinking of the letter in my clutch. "The garden is yours," she told me, I said. I thought she meant the camellias. I leaned in close. She meant everything. The room was absolutely silent. The only sound was the hum of the HVAC system and Blythe's jagged breathing. "This won't hold up," Glenn whispered. "I will contest it. I will get my own lawyer." "You are welcome to try," Perry said. The trust was executed in full compliance with Georgia law. Lorene was examined by 2 independent physicians who confirmed her mental capacity. The document was witnessed and notarized. And tonight's behavior, which I have witnessed personally and which several family members can corroborate, constitutes clear grounds for forfeiture. Blythe turned to me, tears streaming down her face. These weren't the pretty tears she staged for Instagram. These were ugly, terrified tears. "You can't do this," she pleaded. "You can't take everything." "I am not taking anything, Blythe," I said. "Mom gave it to me. 3 years ago. I just didn't know until 11 days ago." "Lorene was my wife," Glenn roared. "For 42 years. You think some piece of paper changes that?" "She was your wife," I said, "and she loved you. But she also knew exactly who you were. And she made sure that when she was gone, you couldn't do to me what you have been doing all my life." "And what is that?" he sneered, making me feel like I don't belong at the table. I picked up the leather bill folder. I looked at the total again. $9,847. I handed the folder to Perry. "This will be deducted from Glenn's next quarterly stipend," Perry said, tucking it into his jacket pocket. "He ordered the dinner. He can pay for it." I looked at Blythe one last time. "You pushed a breadbasket at my son and told him the food wasn't for him," I said. "An hour ago, I wasn't your sister. I was the adopted one." "What changed, Blythe?" "The balance of the bank account." Blythe's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "That is what I thought." I turned to Perry. "We are done here." Perry nodded. He closed the briefcase. Click, click. I turned to Aunt Carol and Uncle Hank. "Thank you for being kind to Eli tonight," I said. Carol reached out and grabbed my hand. Her fingers were warm. "Always," she whispered. I took Eli's hand. He stood up, clutching his book. He looked taller than he had 3 hours ago. We walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see Glenn's face to know he was broken. I could hear it in the silence he left behind. We stepped out of the old pink house and into the Savannah night. The air was thick and sweet, smelling of the river and blooming jasmine. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks in Reynolds Square caught the glow of the street lamps, looking like silver lace. Perry stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Miss Shelby," he said, "I will file the distribution paperwork on Monday. Glenn's residence right at the Habersham property will be formally revoked. I will serve him with notice to vacate within 90 days. I looked at the beautiful old mansion behind us glowing pink in the night. "I don't want to live in that house, Perry," I said. "Your mother didn't expect you to," Perry said. "She wanted you to have the choice." He tipped his head to me, then to Eli. He walked away toward the parking garage, his briefcase swinging by his side. I walked Eli to the car. The city was quiet, most families already home, stuffed and sleeping. Mom, Eli asked as he buckled his seatbelt. Yeah, Grandma Laureen really did all that. The trust and the morality thing she did. I said, starting the engine. Because she loved you. Because she loved us, I said. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the streetlights blur past. She was kind of a badass, he said. I laughed. It started in my chest and bubbled up clear and bright. Yeah, baby. She was. 1 year later. The kitchen smelled of sage and roasting turkey. It was a smaller bird this year, just enough for 3 people, but it was golden and perfect. I set the mason jar of camellias in the center of the round oak table. They were white, blooming vigorously. It had taken 3 years for the bush to flower, but now that it had started, it seemed it would never stop. Eli came into the kitchen carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes. He was taller now, his voice dropping into a register that sounded less like a child and more like the man he was becoming. Table is set, he said. I looked at the 2 place settings. And then I looked at the 3rd one. We had set a place for Perry, who was driving over from his office. But there was something else at the table. Eli pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He placed it carefully between the salt and pepper shakers. It was a drawing of a garden done in colored pencil. Underneath, in his neat handwriting, it said, "For Grandma Laureen." I felt the tears prick my eyes, but they didn't fall. I wasn't sad. I looked at the small table. It didn't have crystal glasses. It didn't have lobster tails. It didn't have a chandelier overhead. But it had peace. Grace, Eli asked. I took his hand. I closed my eyes. Thank you, I whispered. To the empty chair. To the woman who had planted a garden in the dark so I could walk in the light. For everything. The table was small. The table was enough. The doorbell rang. Eli beat me to it. He opened the door, and there was Perry standing on the porch in a sweater instead of his seersucker suit. He looked strange without the briefcase. Lighter. He was holding a bottle of wine in one hand and a small clay pot in the other. Inside the pot was a camellia cutting barely 6 inches tall with one tight bud that hadn't opened yet. For the garden, he said. I took the pot. The soil was damp and dark, freshly packed. I could tell by the way the roots were wrapped that he had done it himself carefully, the way you handle something you intend to last. Come in, I said. Your plate's been waiting. He stepped inside. Eli pulled out his chair. Perry sat down, unfolded his napkin, and looked at the drawing between the salt and pepper shakers. He didn't say anything. He just nodded the way he did. 3 plates, 3 glasses, a jar of white camellias, and a drawing from a boy who understood what family meant before most adults ever would. That night after Perry left, and Eli fell asleep on the couch with his book open on his chest, I sat at the kitchen table, alone. I opened Mom's journal. I had carried it for 3 years, reading her words, tracing her handwriting, holding it like a hand I could no longer hold. I turned to a blank page. I picked up a pen. November. The camellias are blooming. Eli is taller than me now. Perry came for Thanksgiving and ate until he loosened his belt. The cutting he brought has 1 bud. I planted it next to Mom's bush on the east side where it will get the morning light. The garden is growing, Mom. I will keep writing.